After the surrender of the Japanese at the end of the Second World War, America continued its testing of nuclear weapons. But rather than testing those weapons in desolate, useless and unpopulated areas, the USA decided to test them in this idyllic spot in the Pacific Ocean. A genuine ocean paradise. They gave no thought to the destruction of animal habitats, the potential poisoning of the ocean and lands, the death of animals, or the disruption of ecosystems. And those are all terrible ethical concerns to ignore. But the main ethical concern with testing nuclear weapons in this area was that people were living there. This is the story of those people. The sponsor for this video is Private Internet Access VPN, or PIA VPN for short. Now, if you don't know what a VPN is, it basically makes you invisible online, and it stops people from stealing your data. Whether you're online at home or using a mobile device, you're transmitting tons of personal data into the digital ether, which can be viewed by neighbors, your internet service provider, thieves, or worst of all, the government. A VPN is a program which encrypts and hides all that data so people can't see it, or more importantly, they can't steal it. And aside from protecting you from online thieves, it also means that you can access geo-locked streaming content by telling the internet that you're actually in a different country than you really are. So, here in the UK, for example, you can't find Brazilian crime classic City of God on streaming services, but by using PIA VPN, I can tell the site that I'm really in Brazil and agora posso assistir o dia todo. Ótimo, obrigado VPN. PIA is the world's most transparent VPN provider with over 30 million downloads and is a very secure service. They don't log or collect your data in any way, shape or form, so you're safe at all times. If you don't believe me, they've been audited by world famous auditing firm Deloitte, so it gets their seal of approval as well. Personally, I use PIA VPN because they're the best and most secure VPN at this price point, in my humble opinion. And if you sign up with the link in the description box below and the one that's showing on the screen now, you can save 83% and pay just $2.03 per month and get 4 months for free. It's genuinely an amazing deal. So click the link and sign up, and not only will you get a great deal on a VPN service, but you'll also help out the channel too. Back to the video. An atoll is a collection of islands which surround a coral reef. They're places rich in natural beauty and wildlife. They're also fairly important to local sea life ecosystems due to the fact that they exist around a coral reef. Coral reefs are really important for sea ecosystems as the coral generates oxygen, provides shelter and resistance from storms, and also a food supply for creatures which live in the ocean. When coral is destroyed, it basically turns that area of ocean into a ghost town. This is why David Attenborough often emphasizes the importance of protecting coral in pretty much all of his award-winning documentaries. The Bikini Atoll was no different. Looking at the Bikini Atoll, you could easily mistake it for any of the beach holiday spots that you see posted on Instagram. Atolls don't usually contain large populations of people, as it can be difficult to live there due to the fact that a lot of the land is disconnected. But people do live there. In 1946, 167 people lived on Bikini Island in the Bikini Atoll. It had been their home for the entire lineage of those families, which was about 3,600 years. They had never known anything other than life on Bikini Island. The people were mostly fishermen and farmers, but were also skilled boat manufacturers and sailors as a result of the fact a large proportion of their lives and local economy was on the waves. They're an interesting society with customs that are a little different to the average Western society. For example, the women were the ones who held property, not the men, and it could not be bought, it was always inherited or passed down. In fact, land is status in Marshallese culture in general, and is considered the height of wealth and importance. To all Marshallese, land is gold. If you were an owner of land, you would be held up as a very important figure in our society. Without land, you would be viewed as a person of no consequence. Jukwajakeo in 1987. Another quirky difference to our own culture is that women are forbidden from showing their thighs in public, but it's very common to show breasts with little to no attention ever paid to them. Now, if you're wondering why they're all dressed like we are, both in modern and historical photos, well, that's because Christian missionaries arrived on the island and convinced the natives that they'd go to hell and be punished by God for dressing in their traditional clothing. So, the traditional cultural clothing of the people of Bikini was slowly suppressed. Today, nobody wears it. It's as though the missionaries erased it from Bikini culture. The islands had been occupied a couple of times before by foreign influences. In the 1800s, the Germans annexed the islands in order to grow and harvest coconut farms to produce copra oil. The soils throughout Bikini Atoll were incredibly fertile, possibly due to the fact that some of the land was of volcanic origin, as there's a shield volcano just 50 miles away. During World War I, the Japanese landed on the islands and took control, though they mostly left local matters to local people and did nothing with the islands until World War II, when the Marshall Islands suddenly became of great strategic importance for the defending Japanese Navy. Then, in 1944, the American forces captured Kwajalein Island and eliminated the Japanese presence on the islands. And this brings us right up to the point that we began this story. Throughout the whole of history, there is just one country who has used nuclear weapons against anyone. It's something even terrorists have never done, but the USA have. When the USA dropped 2 atomic bombs on the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world witnessed a terror that until that point had never existed. That should have been the only time that terror was ever witnessed. But unfortunately, America has often defined itself by the competition it faces, and when the USSR decided to begin development of nuclear weapons, the USA responded by increasing its own programs. Even though there was no war, the US Navy wanted to know how nuclear weapons would affect ships at sea. More specifically, they wanted to know if it was possible to space the ships out in the harbour to render the effects of a nuclear bomb minimal. Yeah, that's right. According to Newsweek in 1946, that was the reason given for detonating the most destructive force the world had ever seen. To see if some ships on an ocean could resist a force which had levelled cities. Call me skeptical, but that seems more like an excuse than a reason to me. Sounds to me more like Truman and the US military really loved their new toy, and they just wanted to play with it some more. In February of 1946, the US Navy, as ordered by President Truman, arrived at Bikini Atoll and asked the 167 people living there on Bikini Island to voluntarily leave. They told the residents whose families had called this place home for thousands of years that the USA planned to detonate nuclear weapons for the good of mankind. That sounds like I'm making it up, but I'm really not. They genuinely told people that they had to detonate nuclear bombs and destroy their ancestral home to save the world. They even made public propaganda movies to sell this awful narrative back home in the USA and make themselves look heroic. They're literally filming it in this clip here. The people didn't want to leave, and it took many days of deliberation before the king finally understood that although it had been phrased as a request, it really wasn't. The islanders were then all relocated to a nearby island called Rongerik, where they all lived happily ever after. Over the course of the next 12 years, the USA detonated 23 nuclear bombs in the waters of Bikini Atoll. That's just shy of 2 per year. Each bomb bigger, more deadly, and destructive than the last. And each bomb vomiting hundreds of millions of particles of radioactive dust over the landscape like an invisible blanket of death. The United States posited that the bombs would not cause too many problems as a result of nuclear fallout, a hypothesis which was proven incorrect on the very first test. The Crossroads-Baker test of 1946 spewed so much radioactive cesium into the surrounding area that it contaminated all the soil and oceans, making them unusable. The ships, which the USA was testing the bombs on, were so radioactive that the US Navy simply sank them all to the bottom of the ocean. The chairman of the Atomic Commission, a chemist by trade, referred to the Crossroads Baker test as the world's first ever nuclear disaster. Really? Was he asleep during the drop-in of those 2 bombs on Japan? You could excuse the first test of being only reckless, as they really weren't sure what kind of damage it would cause. But in the following 22 nuclear explosions, the United States knew exactly what kind of damage both the blast and the radioactive fallout would cause, and continued to detonate them anyway. I don't think it's unfair to say that they simply didn't care, that they destroyed countless ecosystems, animals and fish, and also ruined the ancestral home of a sovereign people, possibly forever. Now, I know some people in the audience won't see this as a big deal, so, for context, imagine that China decided to detonate 23 nuclear bombs on American farmland, ruining its ability to host agriculture and destroying the surrounding wildlife. Now, even if China agreed to pay billions of dollars in compensation to America for the loss, I imagine absolutely nobody would ever accept it. And neither do the Bikinians. And they didn't get billions of dollars in compensation. The surrounding environment would be continuously pounded by huge explosions, and a massive amount of radioactive material began to permeate whatever wildlife and sea life remained, which wasn't much. According to US Navy records, the nuclear fallout from the testing covered 50,000 square miles. That's 50,000 square miles around Bikini, in which the soil became permanently unfarmable, the seas permanently unfishable, and the land permanently unlivable. 64 people who lived on neighbouring islands, which the USA had claimed would be unaffected by the tests, would later be treated for serious radiation poisoning. I wonder how our island hopping Bikinians are getting along. Maybe we should check on them. In 1948, an anthropologist from Hawaii named Leonard Mason decided to visit the resettled people on Rongerik to see how they were adapting to their new life. What he found genuinely shocked him. All 184 residents were starving and malnourished. When Leonard asked the people what happened to cause this, a villager replied, "We'd get few fish. Then the entire community would have to share this meager amount. And the fish were not fit to eat there. They were poisonous because of what they ate on the reef. We got sick from them, like when your arms and legs fall asleep and you can't feel anything. We'd get up in the morning to go to our canoes and fall over because we were so ill. Then we started asking these men from America to bring us food. We were dying, but they didn't listen to us." The problem was that Rongerik had no arable farming land, as the soil was very low quality, so they couldn't grow any food, not even coconuts. The island had no lagoon, so there were few fish to be found either. What fish they were able to catch was poisoned with radiation from swimming and eating near the reef at Bikini. Even though the fish made all the residents sick, they had no choice but to eat it, often sharing a handful of fish per day between 184 people. When the people of Bikini had first been asked to leave the island, they were told that it was temporary, and many of the people now longed to return to their family homes. They didn't really understand that they would never be able to live there again. As with many things throughout history, the Americans promised the world to the Bikinians and delivered naught but sickness and dust. In 1997, one villager recalled what he was told by the American Navy at the time. "The promises the Americans made will always be remembered by our people. They told us, never mind if you're living on a sandbar or even adrift on a raft at sea. We will take care of you, as though you are our very own children." We believed them, and in a way, we were happy that they would be taking care of us. The world was a strange place for us then. We just couldn't understand why they wanted our island, but we knew that we had to follow their requests. When Leonard returned to the USA, he contacted a journalist named Harold Ikes, who was also a former Secretary of the Interior, who then wrote about the story blaming the US Navy for their ignorance and indifference to starving people who were only in that position because the USA had commandeered their beautiful home and turned it into a radioactive hellscape. The island of Rongerik itself had not been the choice of the Bikinians. It was known to be desolate where nothing grew even before they had been told to live there. Its reputation was such that local islanders believed it to be haunted, and that was why nothing grew there. The USA simply dismissed what the islanders said at the time. They only cared about moving people away from their home, not if they were healthy and happy afterwards. After the negative stories criticising the military had hit the press, the Navy decided to act. They returned to Rongerik and told the former Bikinians that they were being moved again with no arable land or waters for fishing. Their home was a collection of tents set up next to a runway of a US military base on Exile. You know, it's genuinely pretty saddening to see that the people of Bikini went from a happy, peaceful, self-sufficient tropical paradise to living on flour and water paste and begging the US Navy for food while living in tents next to a military runway in just a couple of years. A few months later, the islanders were moved again. Their new home was the island of Kili, a tiny island just a quarter of a mile in size, with no lagoon for fishing and only a tiny patch of land for potential farming. The lack of coral reef and lagoon also meant that the island was constantly battered by strong ocean currents and waves, which made small ship and canoe sailing impossible. Even the US Navy ships had trouble stopping there to deliver food because the sea was so rough and dangerous. To give you an idea of the kind of place that Kili is, consider that during World War II the Japanese had used it as a prison island for POWs. The Bikinians too came to believe their new home was really their prison. The first foreigners to come to this part of the world were the Germans, and then afterwards the Japanese came. During these times, Kili was used as a prison island for people who misbehaved. Then came the Americans. We feel that Kili is like a prison, because we can't sail to another island or even take a long refreshing walk when life closes in on us. Many times even the ships refused to stop and unload supplies for the island. The Americans forgot about their responsibilities to us, and once again, we found ourselves starving. We were full of worry and near death. Their promises were once again not ringing true. Over time, the displaced Bikinians came to realize that they could not support themselves on the island as they couldn't grow enough food or catch enough fish to feed the people. They begged any American they came across to help them. The USA did eventually begin to bring USDA products to the island to help them, but this was not free, and the islanders had to buy it from the USA. But with no trade or economy on the islanders had no money, and soon began to starve again. Actually, money wasn't even really a solid concept for any of the people of the Marshall Islands, as they were a subsistence-based people, or they were anyway. Before America liberated them, they didn't have capitalism there. They just grew their own food and supported themselves and traded handcrafted consumer items with each other for fun and culture, in much the same way that the rest of the world did prior to the 1600s. Today, thanks to America irradiating their farmlands for the next 10,000 years, they're forced to depend on American handouts to survive, because it's literally impossible to support themselves. The islanders grew resentment towards each other for allowing this to happen to them. It created distrust and fighting in a community of people who for thousands of years prior had lived peacefully without wars or conflict. Their lives as self-sufficient farmers and sailors was lost forever. Back then, we would get upset with each other for believing in the Americans and in the promises they made. We would shout at each other that the promises weren't true, because surely this wasn't the best of their ability as they had promised. After all, it was certainly clear that they had forgotten about us. After a couple of decades, the Bikinians had become accustomed to being ignored by the Americans until one day in 1972, a team of scientists arrived to take a group of Bikinians back to their home to plant crops and build houses, telling them that they could finally return home again. 100 people returned to the island. The islanders felt immediately at home and happy, feeling as if the Americans had finally made good on their promise and returned them to their rightful home, where they could fish, grow food, sail and canoe. In the 1970s, I worked on NEU and Bikini, planting crops, pulling weeds, and in general, refurbishing the islands. I felt so happy, peaceful and proud, and why not? It was our land, our islands, and we were content to be working and living there. We felt that we belonged on Bikini. We were told that it was safe to eat anything that we wanted, so we did. We had many kinds of foods, bananas, and things like that. According to some military records, which were later declassified, the scientists were extremely keen to see how radiation affected the human body when exposed to large amounts of it. Did that influence their decision to tell people it was safe to return when it was still lethally radioactive? There's no way to know for sure, but it wouldn't be the first example of the US military and medicine conducting life-threatening experiments on living people without telling them. People began to realize that something was wrong when the rate of stillbirths rapidly increased and miscarriages became common, and children that did survive the pregnancy process were born with deformities, which had never been seen in the 3,000-year history of the island. In 1975, scientists returned to conduct medical testing and found that the people living there had plutonium, strontium and cesium in their blood at dangerous levels, which was likely causing the large increase in medical problems. The coconut trees which had been planted had absorbed the radioactive elements through their roots. This had then been transferred into the milk of the coconuts. The islanders drank the milk multiple times daily. The local crabs, a staple of the Bikini diet, had also become poisoned by radioactive elements because they fed on the shells of the coconuts. The scientists then informed the people of Bikini that they had to leave the island because it was poisoning them. And if they remained, not only would each and every one of them become sick and die, it would eventually corrupt their DNA and make it impossible for people to reproduce and continue their society and lineage. Finally, the Americans and their scientists came back, saying that we had to leave Bikini. They said we had ingested too much poison and that it wasn't safe to live on Bikini anymore. We hated departing from the islands where we had come to know peace and quiet for the first time in many years. With an intense sadness in their souls, they sat on US boats and watched their home, their meaning, their life, bobbing and growing small around the horizon as they returned to their prison island, forever displaced and forever homeless. There are about 5,000 people of Bikini today. Not a single one lives on Bikini Island. While researching this story, I came across a quote from one of the former residents of Bikini Island, which I think perfectly sums up the sadness of the story. Bikini is like a relative to us, like a father, or a mother, or a sister, or a brother. Perhaps most like a child conceived from our own flesh and blood. And then, to us, that child was gone, buried, and dead. If you want to protect your data and access geo-locked streaming content, then please don't forget to download and install PAA VPN using the link in the description box below and get yourself a great deal. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.